Hello, this is Cafecito con Cristyne, a podcast, and I am your host, Cristyne. The intention of this podcast is to explore all the yummy items we can consume that originated from Hispanic countries, specifically in South America. So, a little bit about me. I was born in Miami, Florida, and I come from a Cuban Mexican household, which means I was surrounded by delicious food all the time. I feel fortunate enough to grow up with a wide range of flavors accessible to me. And hailing from Miami, Latin cuisine was always available to me. I grew up eating carne asada, which is Spanish for meats, usually marinated in mojo sauce, which is a concoction of sour oranges, garlic, onion, oregano, black pepper, salt, and your choice of parsley or cilantro. So instead of growing up with the traditional American household meals, instead of like mac and cheese, I had arroz con frijoles, which translates to rice and beans. Instead of mashed potatoes, I grew up with yuca frita. For all those who don't know, yuca is a root of the cassava plant, which mainly grows in tropical countries in South America and Asia. It was one of the first domesticated crops in America, and the first evidence of cassava cultivation dates back 4,000 years in Peru. Anyways, all that to say is that I grew up with dishes that were not typically consumed by most Americans on a daily basis. Every morning before school, my mom would take me to my grandma's house to eat breakfast and pick up my lunch that my grandma had prepared me. I loved it. Although I was sometimes jealous of kids having Lunchables, looking back now, I was extremely privileged to have a grandma that would feed me home-cooked meals that her mother and father before her would make in Cuba. So breakfast was always my favorite. Although as I grew, I always considered how healthy it was, if at all. Nonetheless, it fueled me and I still crave the same breakfast to this day. My abuela she would make me freshly made espresso made from a mocha pot. So espresso is concentrated form of coffee, typically served in small shots. It is made from the same beans as coffee, but it's much thicker, higher caffeine concentrate, and overall stronger. So this is why it's usually served in smaller servings than coffee. And those smaller servings are usually called cortaditos, which we can go in on the next episode. But my abuela would usually make it and add that coffee to the milk, the little bit of espresso. And that creates café con leche. And café con leche translates to coffee and milk. Or you may know it as cafe latte, a cafe latte. So she'd usually put a tablespoon or two of sugar and serve it in my favorite Garfield mug. So along with the café con leche, I would also have a pan tostada. Pan tostada translates to toast, and instead of like Wonder white loaf bread, we consumed white bread as well, but it was Cuban bread from our local bakery. And it's similar to like French or Italian bread, but it has a slightly different baking method and includes the ingredient lard, which is basically pig fat, which creates that beautiful fluff in the middle and a nice crunchy crust on the outer layer. And when fresh, my grandma would just let me eat it as is. But if it was a day or two old, she would toast it and add some butter or soften it up. So I could probably do a whole episode on Cuban bread, but for time's sake, we will move forward. She would also serve me some bizcochos, which translates to like biscuits. And it specifically the one I got was like the Gilda Ladyfingers, which are sugary biscuits. And I would dip them in the coffee, this and the bread, and that would basically be my breakfast every day since I was about 4 to 5 years old. So it is common for Latinx households to give children caffeine young. To me, it was not abnormal. It was very typical, and I turned out okay as far as I know. So, but pondering all this, pondering on my childhood, got me thinking. So, how did this breakfast tradition begin? I remember going to Spain and it was kind of similar. They would have coffee and biscuits, or like a cookie or something. They would dip it in their coffee. So I'm like, wow, did that just because, obviously South America definitely had a lot of colonization from Spain. So I'm like, did that just get passed down? So I want to learn more, which is what this podcast is about. It was, how is it made? What's the history of Cuban coffee? And that's basically what this first episode is going to explore: the history of coffee, how it migrated to the United States, and we're just going to go in and deep dive and talk a little bit deeper into the history. The year is 1748, and coffee farming was virtually non-existent in Cuba. The industry didn't grow until 1790, which is about 42 years after the first coffee plant was discovered. The coffee was founded in the mountainous Western Plains region in Cuba. Fueled by the French farmers fleeing the revolution in Haiti, coffee farmers started to make Cuba their new home. The industry rapidly grew, and soon coffee and sugar were extremely important economic contributors to the beautiful island of Cuba. In its peak, Cuba exported more than 20,000 metric tons of coffee beans per year. In 1960, Cuba produced a record of 60,000 tons of coffee and became the #1 exporter of coffee in the world. So in my research, it seems that José Antonio Gelabert is credited as the person to introduce the first coffee plant to Cuba back in 1748. He was a native from Barcelona, Spain, that is. And do you remember how I mentioned Spaniard colonization? Well, here's a fine example of it. He oversaw Spain's royal treasury in Havana. This included overseeing most of the Spanish colonized Caribbean, parts of eastern Mexico, and the American Gulf Coast. It was recorded that when he arrived in Havana, he bought the first coffee plant from Santo Domingo, also known as the Dominican Republic. Interestingly enough, he and his family made Cuba their home. His daughter ended up marrying a Cuban native, and his direct descendants, Mario Garcia Menocal, became the president of Cuba from 1913 to 1921. Let me correct myself, 1913 to 1921. It was really the French colonists that were fleeing Haiti that during the Haitian Revolution that introduced the Cuban coffee farming method that we know today. So an example of this is Buena Vista Coffee Plantation that was built in 1801 by French refugees from Haiti, and it's the oldest coffee plantation known to be in Cuba. So how were they farmed? These coffee beans were sun-dried on huge drying beds during the daytime. They would then pile up the beans every night in the center of the drying bed and cover them. And if rain did cause any issues, they would bag them up and store them in small, low-thatch sheds with palm tree leaves as the roof. So they use this giant grindstone, like huge. It's known as a tajona. And I think of the Flintstones when I look at it, but it's like a giant wheel attached to a pole, and basically you push that pole and the wheel rolls, and it's in between, almost like a track, between two stone walls, and it's like a track, like going around in a track, the wheel. And that was used to grind and crack the coffee beans. I also think it is super important to note some of the sadder and harsher realities of history so we can learn from them, and I don't think it does any good hiding the truth. So one thing I want to mention and be transparent about is that a lot of the coffee production during this time was made by enslaved groups of African, indigenous, Chinese, Spanish, and other European people. Mostly African and indigenous folks, unfortunately, but the enslaved coffee workers were shackled at night in tiny 8 to 12 person stone cells built onto the walls of the coffee drying beds. These folks are credited for their economic contribution to Cuba during that time without real compensation, obviously because they were enslaved. So Cuba's coffee industry continued to prosper thanks to these folks. But of course, until the Cuban Revolution happened, coffee production declined largely due to the dissolution of large farms. So this caused Cuban coffee producers to mix their coffee beans with roasted peas. And this actually remained a staple in Cuba until pure coffee returned around 2005. And as we know, if you know your American history, in 1962, the U.S. embargo placed on Cuba, they placed an embargo on Cuba for all imported goods. This caused further damage to Cuba's coffee industry. And Fast forward to today, now all coffee from Cuba is exported by Cuba Exports. They pay government-regulated fixed prices to coffee growers and processors. And Japan and France are actually Cuba's major coffee export markets. And Cuban citizens actually are only allowed 2 ounces of coffee rations every 15 days. So that is kind of a background on the history of Cuba, a little bit of a timeline, and where it is at today in terms of where we get it. Obviously, as you can see, the United States isn't a part of that list of Cuba's major coffee export markets. In fact, Café Bustelo is the coffee I grew up with, and that coffee hails from Brazil and Colombia. That is where the coffee I grew up with. So I didn't even really grow up with traditional Cuban coffee, but it's the way that it was made that makes it Cuban. And we will talk a little bit about that in the next episode. We have Café Pilón and Café Bustelo in Miami. So those come from Brazil and Colombia, actually. Actually, it also came originally from Spain, which is interesting. During the Cuban Revolution, millions of Cubans fled and ended up settling in Miami, Florida. Cuban people brought their culture and cafecito traditions with them. Personally, I call Miami North Cuba. I think a couple of my friends and a lot of Floridians probably do as well, especially Miamians. But it's because of how rich and prominent that Cuban culture is. So 70% of Miami is actually Hispanic, and over half of that number, 54%, are Cuban. Spanish is essentially the main language spoken there, and food is mostly Hispanic. Like there is Cuban restaurants everywhere. There's Peruvian, there's Nicaraguan food. So you can really find a little bit of everything there. And in Miami, you can find Cuban coffee everywhere and anywhere. Truly. They always have little shops, little windows to get your Cuban coffee on the go. Next to my high school, actually, we had a restaurant called Sandwich King that students would constantly go to grab some buttered Cuban toast and a small espresso or coffee and milk. And Cuban toast, buttered Cuban toast is super common there too. That's called a pan tostada, and that's something you usually could order with your coffee as well. Something I found extremely interesting in my research of how this tradition of Cuban coffee and bread began was that Cuban bread can be traced back in our very own Ybor City in 1896. La Joven Francesca Bakery was established by a Sicilian-born gentleman named Francisco Ferlinta. Ybor City was a thriving Cuban, Spanish, Italian community in Tampa back then. The bakery sold 3 to 5 cents per loaf, and many were delivered every morning, similar to a milk delivery back in the day. So houses in Ybor City had a sturdy nail driven into the door frame, actually, which I thought was really interesting. On the front porch, they had just a nail right into their door, and the bread delivery person would impale the fresh loaf onto the nail before the end of the day. I found it really interesting that nothing is truly created by native Cubans. Like everything I was raised with, the coffee and the bread and all that. But we Cubans continue to embrace it and to make it a part of our culture and our daily routines. And I really found that intriguing throughout my research, because there comes this logic or this claim of authenticity, right? So it's this idea of authenticity. And I know anywhere you go, if you're traveling to a new country or going to Miami or California or places with diversity and diverse food options, most people want to find the most authentic items that come from that country. But it's super interesting to me that sometimes there is like this idea that authenticity has to be almost pure. And I find it really interesting that there is a mix of everything. Like, it's not what you think. It's not coming from a native person here or there, at least not historically tracked. So what is historically tracked is that it's people from other countries that bring their concepts and their ideas, and then we kind of utilize that and make it a part of our own culture. So I found that really interesting in my research. So in the next episode, if you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for listening to all my ramblings on Cuban coffee. I hope you enjoyed a brief history, an overview of it, and how it got to the United States, especially in Miami. So this next episode, I'm going to have a special guest, and I am going to go a little bit into how Cuban coffee is consumed, the different ways to consume it. And I'm really looking forward to having my special guest over and really going into detail on how to make this coffee so you guys can enjoy some of the coffee that I grew up with, and I know is well loved. Anytime I introduce it to any of my friends or family, they are like, wow, this is incredible. So I'm very eager to kind of share my childhood with y'all. So thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode. Take care.